Imagine a family tree that splits cleanly in half the moment you trace it back far enough. Not metaphorically, biologically. One side of the lineage points firmly toward one continent, the other side points somewhere else entirely. And the strange part isn't that the two sides disagree. Populations mix, borders blur, history is messy. The strange part is that they disagree by almost exactly the same margin, generation after generation, as if something deliberate shaped the split rather than chance. Geneticists call this kind of mismatch a sex-biased signal. The story written by mothers doesn't match the story written by fathers. For one population at the very edge of the habitable world, that mismatch isn't a curiosity. It's a centuries-old crime scene with no body and no confession, written instead into chromosomes that don't lie, even when the people who carry them were never told the answer either. This is the part of the story that was written down. Around the year 985, a fleet of Norse ships crossed open water under Eric the Red and found 2 strips of usable coastline on an island that was anything but green. They called it Greenland anyway, part hope, part marketing, and built a colony split into 2 settlements, one further south, one along the western coast. For nearly 500 years, that colony held on. Farms were built, churches were consecrated, bishops were appointed from distant Norway, cattle grazed on grass that should never have grown that far north at all. Roughly 3 centuries after the Norse arrived, another people came from the opposite direction, not by ship from Europe, but by sled and skin boat out of Arctic Canada. History calls their culture Thule. They settled the northern coasts first, then moved south, hunting whale and seal, with a precision the Norse farmers never matched. For a window of decades, maybe a century, 2 completely different peoples occupied overlapping ground on the same frozen island, one with cattle and crosses, one with harpoons and kayaks. Then, sometime in the 1400s, the Norse simply stop appearing in the record. No final battle, no mass grave, no farewell letter. The last firm date tied to their presence comes from a wedding, documented and never followed by anything else. After that, silence. The Thule, meanwhile, kept going, adapting, surviving, becoming eventually the direct ancestors of the people who live on this island today. It's a clean story. 2 peoples, sequential, mostly separate. One fades, the other endures. The kind of history textbooks are built from, the kind that fits neatly into a single paragraph with 2 arrows on a map. Except for one detail, historians have never been able to fully explain. With a century or more of 2 populations sharing fjords, sharing trade goods, occasionally sharing burial ground nearby each other, shouldn't something else have been shared too? Not just artifacts left behind in the soil, but something carried forward inside bodies into the next generation and the one after that. Here is where modern genetics enters and where the clean story starts to fracture. In 2003, researchers analyzed the Y chromosome, the strand of DNA passed only from father to son, like a surname stamped down through generations of men and never handed to daughters, in a sample of Inuit men across Greenland. What they found was almost unbelievable on its face. An estimated 58% of those Y chromosomes carried a clear European signature. Not a trace, a majority. Then they checked the other half of the equation, mitochondrial DNA. The genetic material passed only from mother to child, like a thread that runs in one continuous line and never crosses to the father's side at all. If the Y chromosome said Europe, mitochondrial DNA should say something close to that too, if real mutual mixing between 2 peoples had taken place over generations of contact. It didn't say that. It said almost nothing European at all. Not a smaller signal, not a faded one, absent. A population in which the fatherline points overwhelmingly toward Scandinavia, while the motherline points overwhelmingly toward Arctic Asia and Canada, isn't showing the genetic fingerprint of 2 peoples gradually blending into one shared family tree. It's showing something far more specific and far more uncomfortable, a one-directional pattern in which European men contributed children into this population at a far higher rate than the reverse. Generation stacked on generation, the imbalance never correcting itself, never averaging out the way ordinary mixing eventually does. Researchers are careful to frame this as a statistical pattern, not an accusation. Population genetics doesn't record consent, or violence, or romance, only who had children with whom and across how many generations. But that asymmetry, confirmed in the 2003 study published in the journal Human Genetics and reinforced by a far larger genome-wide analysis in 2015, doesn't fit the tidy 2 peoples sequential separate narrative at all. That 2015 study went one step further. It searched for any genetic trace of the medieval Norse colony directly inside the modern population. It found none, not a fragment. not a single haplogroup, that genetic surname passed down silently inside the body, that could be traced back to the Norse colonists who lived on this island for nearly 5 centuries. So if the European Y chromosomes weren't Viking in origin, the obvious next question becomes unavoidable. Whose were they, and when did they actually arrive? The first theory is the one that feels right immediately, the one that makes for the cleanest story. Norse men and Inuit women, during that window of contact in the south, mixed the way contact zones almost always produce mixing somewhere. Children were born. Bloodlines merged quietly, generation by generation, even as the wider colony failed for other reasons entirely. Exhausted soil, a worsening climate, the collapse of the walrus ivory trade with Europe. Under this theory, the European Y chromosomes found centuries later aren't a mystery at all. They're an inheritance, a leftover signature from medieval contact, hiding in plain sight inside a population that otherwise looks fully Inuit. It's a satisfying theory, and for years it was the leading assumption, supported by Norse-style chess pieces found at Inuit sites and Inuit carvings found near Norse ruins, hints of trade if not necessarily romance. It had everything a good origin story needs: proximity, time, and a plausible motive. Then the same 2015 genome-wide search that looked for any Norse trace in the modern population returned an answer nobody expected. Not a diluted signal, not a smaller version of the theory holding up under scrutiny, nothing. No detectable genetic contribution from the medieval Norse colony survives anywhere in the DNA of modern Greenlanders, despite roughly a century of overlap between the two peoples in the south. The theory that feels the most human, the most intuitive, the most narratively complete, is the one the genome flatly contradicts. Here is where it gets complicated. The second theory moves the timeline forward by nearly 300 years. If the European fatherline didn't come from the Vikings, the next obvious source is the next wave of Europeans who actually settled here: Danish and Norwegian colonists, missionaries, and traders who began arriving under formal colonization in the early 1700s, more than 2.5 centuries after the Norse vanished. This version of events is less romantic and considerably better documented. From the 1700s onward, European men lived on this island in numbers large enough and for long enough to father children with Inuit women across multiple generations, a pattern that, by its very nature, would load European ancestry almost entirely onto the Y chromosome while leaving mitochondrial DNA largely untouched because the contact ran overwhelmingly in one direction for 200 years. A 2021 genome-wide study tested exactly this, and the numbers held up under scrutiny in a way the Viking theory never managed. The European component in modern Greenlandic DNA turned out to be almost entirely Danish, not generally European, concentrated geographically along the west and south coasts. Precisely where the historic Danish trading posts and mission stations once stood, almost as if the genetic map and the colonial map had been drawn by the same hand. Among admixed individuals, the average split came out to roughly 2/3 Inuit ancestry, 1/3 European, with a meaningful share of that European fraction tracing back only a handful of generations rather than centuries. The dates work, the geography works, the sex bias works. But it leaves one thing unexplained. If European men and Inuit women having children for 2.5 colonial centuries left a clear, traceable genetic signal, why did several earlier centuries of contact between Norse settlers and Thule hunters leave nothing detectable at all? The same biology should apply both times, and here the story stops being simple. The third theory, the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, doesn't argue that Norse-Inuit contact never happened. It argues something colder, that it may have happened briefly and simply didn't survive. Small populations are unforgiving toward minority bloodlines. In a community of a few hundred or a few thousand people, a handful of mixed children born from a rare encounter between two very different groups can vanish from the gene pool within a few generations. Not through violence, not through rejection, just through the ordinary mathematics of who has children with whom, and how easily a small lineage gets diluted out of existence by the population around it. The data doesn't confirm this, it only fails to rule it out. And this island has a precedent for exactly that kind of vanishing. Long before the Norse or the Thule ever arrived, an earlier population, researchers call them Paleo-Eskimos, survived in near-total Arctic isolation for more than 4,000 years. Then, around 700 years ago, they disappeared, not gradually fading into the population that replaced them. Genetically, completely. No continuity, no inherited line connecting them forward to the Thule hunters who took their place. If an entire population's genetic signature can vanish that completely once, in documented data, it raises an uncomfortable possibility for the smaller Norse Inuit question too. Maybe absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence here. Maybe it's evidence of how easily this island erases its own genetic history, the way a page can be scraped clean and written over without anyone noticing the old ink still faintly underneath. To understand how easily that kind of erasure could have happened, imagine standing on a stretch of gravel shoreline in the south of this island in the year 1408, the air cold enough to taste, the wind carrying salt and something colder underneath it. A small stone church stands a short walk from the water, its walls still standing today, 8 centuries later, longer than almost anything else built by human hands on this coast. Inside, a wedding is taking place. A young Icelandic woman, blown off course on her way somewhere else entirely, marrying a Norse man who has spent his whole life on this island and likely never will leave it. Seal oil lamps burn low against the walls, throwing an orange light that smells faintly of fish and tallow. The only warmth in a room built from stone that never quite stops being cold. Outside, your breath fogs in front of your face with every exhale. Somewhere out on the water, far enough that no one inside the church can see clearly, a kayak moves along the edge of the fjord. A Thule hunter, watching, or simply passing on the way to a sealing ground further north. 2 peoples sharing a coastline, separated by a few hundred meters of cold water and an entire continent of cultural distance. This wedding is, as far as the written record shows, the last clearly documented event from Norse Greenland. After this, the letters stop. The ships stop arriving. No final goodbye, no last entry. Just a marriage, recorded, and then nothing else, ever again written down about the people who stood inside that church. And here is where the story doesn't just complicate, it inverts. Because while researchers were busy tracing whose fatherline came from where, a separate question sat quietly underneath the entire debate. What actually let this population survive here at all, in a place this cold, eating a diet rich enough in fat to kill almost anyone else on Earth? The strongest genetic signal ever found in this population isn't about ancestry at all. It's about adaptation. A cluster of genes controlling how the body processes fatty acids, the kind found in seal blubber, whale meat, fish oil, the foundation of a traditional Arctic diet, shows some of the clearest evidence of natural selection ever documented in a human population, with measurable effects on height, on weight, on how efficiently the body burns and stores fat. It adapted to the cold. Adapted, it adapted to the diet. Adapted, it adapted to centuries of conditions that would have killed almost anyone without it. Adapted. Here's the part that reframes everything that came before it. Some of the genetic material behind this adaptation appears to be unusually old enough and rare enough outside this population that researchers studying it have traced fragments of it not to Europe and not to the more recent ancestors of the Inuit either, but to a far older, vanished branch of the human family, Denisovans, an extinct human relative that disappeared tens of thousands of years before either Vikings or Thule hunters ever set foot on this island. Not Europe, not the Inuit either, something older than both. Researchers studying this link are careful to call it a strong signal rather than a settled fact. The connection is still being worked out, not yet fully confirmed, but the implication, even hedged, is hard to ignore. Underneath the fatherline, pointing toward Scandinavia, and the motherline pointing toward Arctic Asia, sits a third inheritance belonging to neither continent, borrowed from a species of human being that no longer exists, anywhere, in anyone. One elder from a fishing village on this island, asked years ago what all this science actually meant for her own family, said something simpler than any study could put it, that she didn't need a chromosome to know whose granddaughter she was, only to know the rest of the story underneath it. Step back far enough, and the lesson here isn't really about one island at the edge of the map. Every population on Earth carries something similar inside it, whether the records ever admit it or not. A genome that behaves less like a single clean story and more like a page that's been written on, scraped down, and written on again. Generation after generation, the older words never fully erased, only buried beneath newer ink. Pull back the right layer, and an old line bleeds through that nobody currently living was ever told to expect. The textbooks prefer arrows. The chromosomes prefer palimpsests. For this island, the textbook version says 2 peoples, sequential and separate. Norse, then Inuit, 500 years apart in the telling. The chromosomes say something else entirely. A fatherline written largely in Scandinavian ink, a motherline written almost entirely in Arctic ink, and underneath both of those, a third layer borrowed from a species of human that vanished from the world long before either story began. Not Inuit, not European, a page layered with handwriting from more sources than anyone living was ever told to expect, and the oldest line on it still hasn't finished being read.